Hi, welcome to this programme, which is part of our Formation series. And in this series of programmes, I'm joined by the Reverend Will Vanderhart from St Peter's in West Harrow, in inner city London, and also Rob Waller, who's a consultant psychiatrist, not psychologist, psychiatrist. I got that right. Working with the NHS in Scotland. These chaps are here because they represent the Mind and Soul Network. You can find out about them if you just Google Mind and Soul Network. And talking about our mental, emotional, spiritual well-being in ministry. This programme particularly is looking at the whole network that we exist within as people who are concerned about the life of our community. There's others that we can work alongside and work with. I sort of recall numbers of situations when we've had to be involved with other professionals, people who are a lot more skilled up than us. I can think of a teenage boy suffering a bereavement and became very, very angry, excluded from school, and just recognising that our team there lacked the capacity to be able to really deal with this deep pain that this young man was feeling. And similarly, a girl who had a baby quite young and then began to struggle with postnatal depression. And again, once recognising that had begun to manifest, what do we do to help and how do we support? So these are the kind of issues that I suppose our teams have been presented with on a day-to-day basis. So, Rob, perhaps this sort of tendency that we might have to want to be the answer to every problem, and yet having to sort of release a bit of that control to others and beginning to do that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, of course, the nice thing is that gives me a job because one of the things I do is I get paid to do this, and I've got a team around me who can help me do this. So there's some things that we wouldn't be expecting the local church to do. So, for example, if someone is so suicidal that they're not safe and they have to come into hospital for a while, or if someone is, for example, very psychotic and living in a different reality and likewise needs treatment, there's a few other things I can think about. Maybe someone who's got alcohol-related brain damage or dementia and their behaviour is very difficult. Or somebody with, maybe OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, hoarding, some of these kind of things where it's not a matter of loving that person more. Yeah. It's actually that this person needs skilled help, and sometimes that skilled help is they need to come into hospital for a while or have an awful lot of support, and the local church, the local faith community is just not set up to provide that.
Do you find, Will, within your congregation that there are folks who they sort of need to be needed, and they really want to give their best to those who have got complex needs, but perhaps you as a pastor need to draw a line and say, whoa, you're getting involved too deeply here?
Yeah, we always at risk at sort of encouraging what I call compulsive carers. They're people who often have a deep hidden inner need to be needed, as you say, and they can often wade in and believe that they are the answer to other people's problems. Very often they actually need quite complex help themselves. What we have to do is recognise that to work safely with people who, particularly people who are struggling with mental and emotional health issues, a broad base of confidential network to gather people equipped for a role and task will do a far better job than any individual who believes it's their personal calling or mission to fix others.
Yeah. So, who we're going to call? I mean, where do you start? I must admit to being somewhat confused by the whole sort of health sector. There seems to be, specialists in everything. And I know from our team leaders, I can think of one particular young person whose needs were so complex, they basically managed her diary. She had about 15 different specialists she was seeing. So where do we start?
I mean, if you start with the big three, so health, social work, police, start with the big three. And of course, if you go back in time, a few hundred years and that sort of thing, the church did do a lot of these roles because these things didn't exist. So the NHS started just after the Second World War. Social works and councils grew out of the parish system to a certain extent. The police have been around for a little bit longer. But I guess it might be helpful to sort of think, well, what's the primary duty of these people? And the primary calling of the NHS, we might moan about waiting lists and that kind of stuff, but the primary duty of the NHS is healthcare free at the point of delivery. Yeah. And we've got an amazing resource in this country that is literally the envy of the world. Yeah. Other parts of the world have got free healthcare to a greater or lesser extent, but the NHS NHS is absolutely first class, and it's staffed by wonderful people who fundamentally want to help. Likewise, social work, their primary model is that the problems of life are caused by social inequality and social exclusion.
Yeah.
So they're all about re-establishing the equalities in society. Both the NHS, social work, the police, they are biased towards the poor. We may think it's service for all, but no, they're biased towards the poor. They're rightly biased towards the poor, sometimes putting the church to shame, which is why it's great to have initiatives like the Eden Networks that are challenging that. But the social work are there about, working in social exclusion, working in social equality. And likewise, the police, we might think that they're going around locking people up, but actually the police's primary duty is to preserve life. If you read the police's guidance, their primary duty is to preserve life. So they will rescue someone who's suicidal on a bridge. That's their primary duty. They're actually more interested in that than they are in prosecuting crime and chasing criminals.
Yeah. On a simple level, though, I mean, if it's non-emergency, it's not a 999 call. What do? Do we get the yellow pages out? Do we start Googling health services in my area? Who's the point of contact?
Well, there's sort of, as you say, there's non-emergency bits of all of these things. So anyone in the UK can ring up the social work department, and they can either ring up the social work department to say, I'm struggling, or actually this is quite a good way, perhaps, if you've noticed that, for example, the old lady down the road is really, really struggling. Anyone can ring up the social work department and say, I'm worried about the person at number 6, and the social worker have got a duty to investigate. So that's a good way of just doing it. You can just ring up and run it by the duty social worker. Likewise, the police, they've usually got a number for non-emergencies. Most places have still got a beat Bobby. Someone who's the community police officer. You need to find out who that person is, invite them around for a cup of tea, find out what their needs are, see if you can help them. And likewise, the NHS, you've got your GP. Try to avoid A&E because their focus is around fixing the problem and getting you out the door again, whereas the GP's more interested in the continuity of care.
Yeah. Will, I wonder if at this point you might help me to understand a little bit about the role of prayer in our care. And so as Christians, that may be our first thought. I hope it would be.
Yeah.
But then we perhaps get to a point where we think, okay, seems like God, for whatever reason, doesn't want to do a miracle right here, right now, in this moment. And so I'm going to have to enlist a bit of help. Any advice or guidance as to when is the right time to pick up, to say, I'm going to stop praying now, I'm going to pick up the telephone?
I mean, Rob's outlined a pretty comprehensive structure which we need to work within. And what we'd always say is important to act and pray. And actually the Gospel's full of that. The prayerful actions of the people, in discipleship. And what I get away from is, when you're dealing in any sort of crisis situation, protection is the first thing you need to be concerned about. So before you, obviously pray before you enter any situation or circumstance which has the potential to be a threat to either you or the client you're working with. But when you've entered into a situation, ensure that you are personally safe. That's essential. And then seek the safety of the person that you're potentially working with. When you are going to then launch forth, with some encouragement, some investigation, or some words of counsel, avoid praying in a way which might stimulate someone's distress. So until you have a strong relationship and an understanding of the state of play, for example, praying with someone who might be in the early stage of a psychotic episode, in a way which might be leading towards deliverance ministry or sort of a very ethereal Holy Spirit style ministry, might actually be quite unhelpful to them. Okay. So trying to introduce prayer gently, if you're seeking to pray, and I very often in difficult circumstances will just say, let's just pray, God, your will be done in this situation. Show us your presence, be with us and guide us. And then say amen, and then begin the process of making any referral with agreement, if possible, with the person that you're working with. So I like to, God is present, and you don't need to have extensive prayers in order to invite God's presence. Containing prayer is about acknowledging that God is present in the situation and bringing comfort, and then begin the process of action in working these things out. So, we have to be cautious, but we also have to be explicitly Christian.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say, of course, Matt, you don't always have permission. In that, if you can involve the person in the situation, well, great. But you don't always have permission. And I suppose one thing people might be thinking is, well, when should I act? And the advice I always give people is, despite the fact that you're listening to this session on mental health training and so on, you're not therapists, you're not doctors, you are fundamentally members of the public. So if someone tells you that they're going to bridge X and they're going to kill themselves, phone the police. And if they say, why did you phone the police? The answer is, what did you expect me to do? So, you have to behave as a member of the public in these kind of situations. You don't have to sort of think, oh, well, have I done my 3-stage risk assessment here? Let's not get clever about this. Just behave as a member of the public. Likewise, if they're saying nothing and they're just choosing to not go along with you, but you can't see any particular risk that you're particularly worried about, that's their choice. And if they say, why didn't you help me? The answer is, you didn't let me. So, you haven't got the Mental Health Act on your side.
So we're going to go to questions in just a second and give people opportunity to talk about this. Just before we do that, because it would be, if it was all black and white and we could, it was all crisis and it was all people wanted to jump off bridges, maybe our thinking would be much clearer. But I wonder if either of you got any tips really. What would be kind of, I suppose, thresholds and indicators that you'd be looking for if you've been kind of growing in concern about an individual and then suddenly you think, you know what, that now tips the balance. Now that they've said that or they've demonstrated that little behaviour, that's my cue to do something.
I think the key thing is how well do you know them. So, perhaps if it's the first time you've met someone, you'll have a lower threshold for doing something about it. Whereas if actually you've known someone for a number of years, then, you might be willing to sort of listen to a little bit more. So, I suppose err slightly on the side of caution, but, particularly people who you don't know, you're going to want to sort of think a little bit more about things.
I think it's essential. My top tip is to ask questions and then to ask the same questions later on in a conversation. And what I found is that if I ask a specific question and then I continue a conversation and I ask the same question 10 or 15 minutes later, if the answer that I received the second time round doesn't match the answer that I've been receiving the first time round, something significant's gone wrong. And when I've worked with people who have been moving into any manic or psychotic episode, I found that the answers given on the first request and then given on second request are so different as to show me there's some form of disconnection there which needs greater follow-up. So that's just one tip in terms of how we might ask questions and see whether or not we're getting either a rational, logical stream of thought or whether their minds are jumping around and maybe there's a mismatch in conversation.
Great.
One
Thanks,
last quick tip. People say and people believe all kinds of weird things. We've got lots of eccentrics in this country. But
I'm one.
When people are entering into a period of severe mental illness, everything falls apart. It's not just what they're saying, it's also their hygiene, their timing, their eating, their self-care. So watching out for a global decline.
Thanks, chaps. We're just going to take a break here and we'll give you opportunity now to talk about some of this material around your tables. You'll have a few notes to help you do that and we'll join with you again in a few minutes. Welcome back. I'm here with Will and with Rob, and we're halfway through this programme discussing how we interact with other agencies in our desire to help people achieve emotional and spiritual well-being. And I think we'll start by perhaps this scenario that we touched on a little bit in the first part, which is we're going to make the call, we're going to get in touch. And I imagine most people, certainly many of those who are involved in this training, will have never done that before. They've never actually made a referral. They don't know what to expect from that first contact, particularly with the NHS. They get through to a particular department or a switchboard or something like that. How are they going to be processed? What should they expect?
I mean, I guess at the end of the day, any big organisation can process things in a very factual and unhelpful manner. But these agencies, by and large, are staffed people who want to help. They're staffed people who are compassionate people who've probably got many of the same values that the Eden team members are going to have. They're going to want to help people. They're going to want to see a person get better, see them move on with their life, and it could be health or social work or police. The desire is the same. So I think it's about recognizing that 90% is shared. And yeah, there might be some spiritual aspects that are not shared, but they won't necessarily be hostile. So I think you can say, I'm ringing up, I'm after some help with this person. And
now, we all hear about the NHS being under pressure and cutbacks and all that kind of thing. And maybe worry about, will we go on a waiting list? Will we get dealt with quickly? All that kind of thing. Should we be worried about that stuff?
It can happen, definitely, and I think it depends on the problem. And actually, one of the best things you can do is perhaps go along to the first appointment with the person.
Right.
I know as a doctor, if I have 2 people walk into my consulting room, that's far better than 1 person coming, because I know that person's got someone...
That's allowed, is it?
It is allowed.
What about confidentiality and that stuff?
I'll check that at the beginning, and I may want to see the person by themselves for 5 or 10 minutes, and if I'm doing some ongoing work, I might not want the other person there for every single session, but I'd rather have a bunch of people and know the stuff going on and then deal with getting to the bottom of the problem separately later, rather than have one person come in and say, I haven't got any friends in the whole world, help me.
Yeah. Now, you're not a GP, you're not in general practice, so how do people get to you? What hoops do they have to jump through to find their way into your office, Rob?
Well, most places have got, an emergency and a routine way. So, anyone can go to A&E anytime, day or night, most A&Es anyway, and pitch up and say, I'm having problems, please can you help me? And you'll get help. You might see the junior psychiatrist or the nurse on call. If you want to get to see me, it's usually after you've been admitted to hospital, or if your GP makes a referral. And generally speaking, if you can develop a relationship with the GP, a lot of them have triage meetings in the GP surgery where you can work out whether or not you're going to see a psychiatric nurse, a counsellor, a psychologist, a psychiatrist. You can probably go through that if you've got the time and get to the right place. If you go through the emergency route, the risk is that you try and seal the problem over, get it better, get the person out of hospital again. So taking time to get to the right person versus how quickly do I need this help.
Okay. Now, Will, how long have you been in West Harrow?
Nearly 5 years.
Okay, and so in that time, you must have built up, I imagine, from scratch, a network of people that you can relate to and refer to. And what does that look like? Describe it.
Well, I think the best way for Eden teams to work is obviously the way they're already working, which is by relationship and network. And I think you have to be quite intentional about that and say, actually, what are the resources available to us, and potentially what could we need in the future? It's no good really trying to broach this stuff when you're in crisis. Broach it when you are preparing for crisis, and when a crisis comes, if it sadly comes, then you'll be able to use those resources well. As Rob said, understanding where your local GP is, going in, making yourself known is something that will be welcomed, not something that they'll be hostile to. The local GP will also be the primary point of psychiatric referral for non-emergencies. And we work closely with the CAMS team, which is the Children and Adolescent Mental Health Services team.
Right.
So many members of that team are working with young people local to us. We know members of the CAMS team. And so we make sure that young people who are vulnerable we are working with and that they're working with are held in some bridging sort of relationships. We also are aware where the local mental health unit is, and most estates have a mental health unit who deal with individual cases with a key worker. And we've befriended local key workers, and we've actually found out that one of the psychiatric nurses who works there is also a Christian and loves doing similar work to the work that we're doing. So you can actually create a broad array of relationships through your GP. We also have good relationships with the community police teams, with social services, with the NSPCC direct phone number, and we have made sure that we've got names and contacts every time we use an agency. That way, the next time we need to make a referral, we ask for Jan at the NSPCC, or we ask for Tanya at Harrow Women's Aid, or we ask for Mary at the Wish Centre, and we can just go straight back to that person. They trust you, they relate to you, they know you're going to give them solid information, and you're going to help them to do their job well.
Yeah. Are you able to illustrate that with perhaps a little story of somebody that you have referred and why you did
we
so?
make regular referrals, and I primarily make referrals to GP first, but because of my psychological knowledge, very often I can meet someone and make some sort of assessment, which will be a first step. Not everyone is in that same position, but I do remember early on in ministry, a very kind of handsome and well-heeled young man strode into my office with a backpack on and sat down, and he began telling me a story that he was being abused at home, that he'd been thrown out of his home, that his parents were treating him really badly, and that there was a multiplicity of problems in his world. I looked at him and I made all sorts of assumptions. He was private school educated, he was smart, he was articulate, and I thought he must be telling me the truth.
Yeah.
And as I listened to him, I began to go into sort of crisis mode. How could I fix his problem? And I asked him a second question to clarify a question that he'd asked earlier, and the answer was completely different. And I remember thinking, how strange that he just told me one thing 1 minute and then something different the next. And then just off the cuff, at that time, I said to him, have you ever had any contact with mental health services? And he said, oh yes, I've actually been hospitalised 3 or 4 times. And I said, are you on any medication? He said, well, I haven't actually been taking my medication for about a month. And then immediately it clicked that here was someone who had a psychological disorder, who'd stopped taking medication, who was in a psychological crisis, and I could probably discount a large amount of what he just told me regarding the physical issues that he was facing in the home. And instead I said to him, do you know your GP? And he said, oh yes. And I said, well, I'll call him, we'll make an appointment, and I'll take you to that appointment if that's okay with you. He said, brilliant. So I phoned his GP, booked an appointment, we went down the street together, sat in the waiting hall together, and I kept consoling him and talking to him. Then I asked his GP if I could have permission to join. His GP referred to him and said, is this okay? He said, fine. I said to the GP exactly what I'd understood and heard. He knew the case very well. He was able to offer suitable treatment, and then this young man was taken on to the next stage of recovery. That's a classic example of how to do this well. And at that time I had no special psychological knowledge, and I had no broad network of mental health professionals around me.
That's really helpful. Yeah, and I must admit, as we talk this through, I myself, I'm certainly no expert in this. That's why we're doing it, and I'm kind of reassured by this. I think there's still a little niggle there, which is something that I sense folks on our teams may share, which is because we spend so much time trying to build this kind of Christian foundation in people's lives, there's this worry that when we get into this kind of secular universe of, real mental health professionals, that's somehow going to be undermined. It's almost faith might be at threat there. Do we need to be worried about that, Rob?
Yeah. Well, I mean, use the word secular. I'm not sure it is a secular universe. I mean, one of the Department of Health's top 5 priorities is spirituality. So, and spirituality like I say, the church used to do mental health care, and we know that medication, talking treatments are only part of the answer. So the Department of Health and the NHS is looking for other approaches to mental health, and spirituality is one of those. People are often and always going to stumble over the word Jesus, but certainly spirituality is not as hostile perhaps as it was 20, 30 years ago. People don't quote Freud and say, you're just making up for an absent father anymore. That's not the fashion at the moment. What is the fashion is alternative approaches to mental health. If I'm talking to someone who maybe doesn't share my views and I'm worried that they're going to be anti a person's faith, you can start off, and I think most people would agree that being part of a local community. Now, you don't differentiate between the church and the Rotary Club at this point, but they're both ways to get you out of the house, they're both ways to meet people. And actually, the positive beliefs we've got in Christianity, like, God is your father, that he cares for you, he wants to invest in you, he thinks you're worth dying for. Those are important beliefs. Likewise, faith and religion can have negative beliefs. We often talk about the excessive guilt some people labour under, the idea of God who's like a headmaster who wants to sort of tell you off whenever you've done something naughty. Those religious beliefs are unhelpful and actually ought to be challenged both by psychologists and by the church. So I think it's a more open ground. You can go in, you can discuss it, you can say, my faith is important. The Equality Act says that if a person's got a strong religious belief and has strong faith, that should be built on and encouraged. And if it's not being, you've got reason, if you think someone's actually undermining a person's faith, you've got every right to take that up with the manager and make a complaint.
Right. Wow. That's immensely helpful. Thank you, chaps. Well, time for you to have some more discussion around your tables, and hope that's fruitful for you. And we've got more programmes in this series. I hope you enjoy those too. Bye for now.